Hello, I'm Pete Shirlow, the Director of the Institute of Irish Studies, and I'm here today to introduce Seamus Heaney, Poets on the Poetry of Seamus Heaney. As you will know, last year we had a wonderful first annual Seamus Heaney lecture, and we're so delighted that this was gifted to us by the wonderful Heaney family. And the first speaker last year was the Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University, Professor Louise Richardson, who I am sure is part of the team today that is celebrating that Oxford University has come up with a vaccine which will be so critical to us getting out of this wretched pandemic. So we've had to park the lecture for a year, and we thought that getting together some poets and Bríd Brennan, the actor, to read and talk about the poetry of Seamus Heaney would be part of that overall contribution that art and culture has played in getting us through the pandemic. Bernard O'Donoghue talks about the little Irishisms, the hold on, I'll just run out, the who is, the she and the I, and of course that work which came from County Derry via Seamus Heaney, plays upon the way in which we peculiarly use English, and of course in bringing that to the world, he brought not just a recognition of our peculiar use of English, but also brought with it that real sense that language is intimate to place. Gail McConnell speaks about that capacity of Seamus Heaney to be so important and so meaningful to so many people because of the familial, the tender, and the intimate, which of course is throughout his work. A former student of the Institute, Seán Hewitt, who is carving out a career as a poet and very successfully, talks about how when he reads Heaney, he first of all understood that Heaney is thinking through himself, but in so doing, he is ultimately thinking about all of us. Tara Bergin talks about how she knew the work of Seamus Heaney, she appreciated the work of Seamus Heaney, and she had never thought of herself as writing in the style of Seamus Heaney until one day she realised that unlike Seamus Heaney, she did not let her inner self into her work, and at that point of recognition, she changed the style of her poetry to let her inner self more free and to run through her work and to influence what she wrote. Our final contribution is from Yousif, who, when a small boy in a Palestinian camp, used literature to learn English. And he talks very clearly about the day that he first read Digging, and the day that he went to his brother and pointed at this name which he had never seen before, and said and wondered with his brother, where is this name from? So from a small farm in Derry to a Palestinian refugee camp, what we find is Seamus Heaney and his capacity to unite us all, irrespective of our backgrounds, our situations, and our cultures. Of course, Seamus Heaney's name has popped up a few times during the year, and President-elect Joe Biden has clearly referenced his passion for Heaney's poetry. And one of the things I read during the year that reminded me of how important Seamus Heaney is was when the journalist Jonathan Jones in The Guardian wrote, "I didn't fall for Joe Biden until I learned that he loves the poetry of Seamus Heaney. Anyone who responds to the steady, humane voice of Heaney has the character of soul you can trust." So it's in that character of soul that you can trust that we bring you Human Chain, which I hope you enjoy. And most of all, I hope that I see you soon, that we congregate again, that we celebrate together, that we take our culture to the world, and that we share our inner voice with everybody. I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.
My name's Catherine Heaney, and it's a pleasure to be here for this virtual event. And on behalf of my family and the Estate of Seamus Heaney, I'd like to extend thanks to you all for taking the time to join us. Last year, the estate was delighted to collaborate with the Institute of Irish Studies at Liverpool University on the inaugural Seamus Heaney annual lecture. The first lecture was given by Professor Louise Richardson, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford. And Louise knew my father from their shared days at Harvard. But her lecture also set the bar incredibly high for what will become an annual event. And we also had wonderful readings on that occasion from Adrian Dunbar, who, as always, brought some of my father's poems to life for the audience. It was a very memorable evening, and we'd been looking forward to another trip to Liverpool for what would have been the second lecture. But of course, as with so much else in this tumultuous year, our plans changed, and we're not in Liverpool. But even so, we were determined to mark the occasion, and we're delighted to continue our partnership with the Institute with tonight's virtual event and this wonderful collection of voices. In each of the videos you're about to see, a writer reflects on a poem or a piece of prose by my father and talks about what it means to them and how it has left its mark on their own work. Aside from the scholarly insight and illumination they bring to the work and the diversity of their respective vantage points, I found myself surprised and extremely moved by the personal nature of their stories. Be it Tara Bergin's memory of meeting my father after a reading when she was a PhD student, to Yousif Qasmiyeh's experience of reading Digging in a refugee camp in Lebanon. Each of these writers offers a new way into the work, and they allow us to encounter it afresh or to look at it from an unexpected angle. And it's my hope that students watching these pieces will feel welcomed into the poems, that they're an invitation to listen, in the words of Gail McConnell, who's another of the contributors. And maybe that long-time readers will come away with a different perspective or an impulse to revisit the poems. So really, in closing, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone at the Institute of Irish Studies, to Peter Shirlow, Niall Carson, Ellie Lybeck, Dorothy Lynch, and everyone who's worked behind the scenes to bring this event together, to our 5 brilliant speakers who you'll be hearing from now, and also to Bríd Brennan, who, as always, reads my father's work with a faultless ear for its rhythms and cadences. And of course, thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us here or there, wherever you are. I hope the pieces you're about to hear will touch you as much as they did me, and that we can all celebrate together again in Liverpool in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Massbawn, 2 poems in dedication for Mary Heaney. Sunlight. There was a sunlit absence. The helmeted pump in the yard heated its iron, water honeyed in the slung bucket, and the sun stood like a griddle cooling against the wall of each long afternoon. So her hands scuffled over the bakeboard. The reddening stove sent its plaque of heat against her where she stood in a flowery apron by the window. Now she dusts the board with a goose's wing. Now sits, broad-lapped, with whitened nails and measling shins. Here is a space again, the scone rising to the tick of 2 clocks. And here is love, like a tinsmith's scoop sunk past its gleam in the meal bin.
A call. "Hold on," she said. "I'll just run out and get him." The weather here is so good, he took the chance to do a bit of weeding. So I saw him down on his hands and knees beside the leak rig, touching, inspecting, separating one stalk from the other, gently pulling up everything not tapered, frail and leafless, pleased to feel each little weed root break, but rueful also. Then found myself listening to the amplified grave ticking of hall clocks, where the phone lay unattended in a calm of mirror glass and sun-struck pendulums. And found myself then thinking, if it were nowadays, this is how death would summon every man. Next thing he spoke, and I nearly said I loved him. But I suppose what I like so much about this poem is a call from Spirit Level in 1996. It's a perfectly kind of constructed little scene, you know, which Heaney does so well. In fact, it begins more like a dramatic excerpt, more like a play, really, than a poem. Just by bringing somebody onto the stage, and the first line, in a kind of Irishism, you know, hold on, I'll just run out, and so on. Who is she and who is I? You know, it's all there to be revealed. You know. Also, the poem, the name of the poem is interesting because it's a call, which is the Irish term for a phone call. Whereas in England, people say a ring or a bell or a buzz or something. But the phrase a call in English usage means a social call, which is exactly what this isn't. You know, it's a call down the line, which as an Irish phrase, really. So it moves on just imagining, you know, while she goes away from the phone, it seems, to run out and get him. He imagines what the scene is, you know. And he hears the amplified ticking of hall clocks. An interesting moment there with the clocks are in the plural, you know, so he must know the scene. I know there are two clocks, I suppose, within earshot kind of thing. But also there's a touch of mystery about that, I think, which is something else which Heaney just kind of plants in poems, I think, in that kind of way, as a kind of enhancement, really. It also makes you wonder, of course, who he's ringing, you know. I think, generally speaking, people tend to, you tend to think perhaps he's ringing his mother, who goes out to find his father. And of course, it fits that setting very well. But actually, I think Heaney said once that, in fact, it's the Freels he's talking to Anne Freel, who goes out to find Brian, who's doing the weeding. And then he moves suddenly from there, from imagining the scene at the other end of the phone, to a much kind of wider kind of exercise of the poetic imagination, really. And he thinks of the medieval, another play connection. He thinks of the medieval play Everyman, you know, where the allegorical play, where Everyman, of course, in the end, is sort of summoned by death, you know. And he suddenly has this extraordinary thought, you know. If we were nowadays, death wouldn't appear just as a sort of apparition, you know, or a vision. Death would just ring up, you know, and say, your time's up. You know, he'd call up to get you. And I think things like the Seventh Seal by Bergin, you know, which is very familiar exercise of that notion in Heaney's time, really. So, having introduced the idea of death, which is so subtly introduced, I think, by the breaking of the little weeds, you know, that's where the notion of that's why he's rueful also, you know. He's killing these little bits of life. So the notion of death is somehow imported to the poem in that extraordinary kind of subtle way. And then he thinks, that this is how death would summon every man nowadays. So he's thinking about the question of death. And in the last line, when he comes in, the person he's ringing up comes in and spoke. And he nearly said he loved him. And of course, he only nearly, because, you know, it's the Irish male exchange, you know. And it reminds you of his taciturn father and so on. So there's so much going on in the poem, you know, just extraordinary range, really, of situations there. The actual situation, the kind of the friendliness of the address, and the Irish vernacular that runs through it all. But then going out to this huge perspective, you know, of life and death, and this big literary context as well. So I think I first encountered Heaney in the late '60s through poems in various journals and magazines, like the New Statesman and the Listener, and Encounter, the Irish Times, Hibernia, and so on. But then Tom Paulin and I were students together in the late '60s, early '70s, and Tom gave me Death of a Naturalist. And that's when I read them kind of all together. I've been very kind of bowled over by them. And of course, it was a nice way to encounter them because it was Tom's northern insight and kind of familiarity with the whole thing on the ground. And I could do the agricultural stuff, because it's extraordinary how similar the agricultural practices in the north and the deep south of Ireland were exactly the same, really. And then the next thing I remember very particularly is reading North, the whole of North, on a hot bus trip driving up through England, from Oxford to Manchester, in fact, and being completely captivated by it, and I think it remains the Heaney volume that I admire the most. It's a kind of poetry that shifted your understanding of what poetry can do, and indeed what capacity there is in it. If I was pushed to say which volume I liked best, I think maybe it would be Fieldwork or perhaps Human Chain, the last book, with the extraordinarily affecting personal depth to it, But I suppose what I most admire in Heaney is the capacity to express fairly simply universal truths or sentiments. And that, I think, is what explains his worldwide popularity. He speaks for everyone, the everyman, really, coining these haunting phrases like neighbourly murder and Greek with consequence, and personal things like the comparison of the weeping willow inclined towards the appetites of gravity. You never see a weeping willow again, I think, without a phrase coming into your head. I've been concentrating on the personal in his poetry here, because he's a major public poet of a kind that's not common in English, and that was his other huge contribution to English poetry, to express the kind of the public predicament in Northern Ireland and elsewhere, really.
Fodder, or as we said, fodder. I open my arms for it again, but first to draw from the tight vice of a stack the weathered eaves of the stack itself, falling at your feet. Last summer's tumbled swathes of grass and meadowsweet, multiple as loaves and fishes, a bundle tossed over half doors or into mucky gaps. These long nights, I would pull hay for comfort, anything to bed the stall. Seamus Heaney's Fodder is a poem I didn't think had impressed itself upon my ear until I found myself writing a poem called Untitled Villanelle, in which the repeating words at the end of the lines are mother and father, or versions of mother and father, finally becoming the word father-mather. It's a made-up word with Heaney's father in it. And father-mather is a sort of genderqueer amalgam of mother and father. And the word is a way of exploring the landscape of queer parenthood, in which I find myself a non-biological parent to a child carried in my lover's body. It's a sort of nonsense word like our toddler's babble. And Heaney's poem offered me an invitation to listen for soundings and to play, to write words not yet present in the language, and to write in a language of the ear as well as the eye, to notice what I heard and not just what I read, to think about the I and we that speaks and perhaps who polices that speaking. I love that Heaney's poem opens with or, giving the slip to the title. This is a poem about the politics of naming, the first in a book, Wintering Out from 1972, which thinks through the roots of things and linguistic colonisation. Heaney notices the codes and shibboleths of the places he calls the land of password, wink and nod. But what is happening here is familial, tender and intimate. Fodder, after all, is just one letter away from father, and Heaney's we refers in the first instance to the speakers within his family, as well as to those speakers in places named later in the book, places like Anahorish. Here, though, Heaney's attention is with fodder, straw to feed cattle, perhaps barely worth attention, except in Heaney's gaze. For as fodder is more than hay, fodder is more abundant too. It is food, but also sustenance and comfort. I open my arms for it. I love the tenderness and intimacy of Heaney's posture and embrace. Naming these things is the love act and its pledge, as Kavanagh puts it. And Heaney's fodder has sacramental presence, multiple as loaves and fishes from the gospel narrative. A parable of miracle, perhaps, but also of community organisation. It is bound and unbound, falling generously in tumbled swathes, and then bundled and given. In the poem's 3 sentences, fodder is imagined, remembered, and longed for. The poem knows so much about containment and carrying, how meanings are carried over time and through naming. Fodder showed me how to write not just with the eye and with the hand. It showed me how to write in the language of the ear and of the tongue. It invited me to open out into the boldness of or, and to name myself using the language of home rather than the language of the state, a language we make up as we go, fodder mather. This is just one of the gifts of Heaney's extraordinary poetry.
The Strand at Lybeck, in memory of Colm McCartney. Leaving the white glow of filling stations and a few lonely street lamps among fields, you climbed the hills towards Newton Hamilton, past the fuse forest, out beneath the stars. Along that road, a high, bare pilgrim's track, where Sweeney fled before the bloodied heads, goat-beards and dog-eyes in a demon pack, blazing out of the ground, snapping and squealing. What blazed ahead of you? A faked roadblock? The red lamp swung, the sudden brakes and stalling engine, voices, heads hooded, and the cold-nosed gun? Or in your driving mirror, tailing headlights that pulled out suddenly and flagged you down, where you weren't known and far from what you knew, the lowland clays and waters of Lybeck, Church Island spire, its soft tree line of yew. There you once heard guns fired behind the house, long before rising time, when duck shooters haunted the marigolds and bulrushes, but still were scared to find spent cartridges, acrid, brassy, genital, ejected, on your way across the Strand to fetch the cows. For you and yours and mine fought shy, spoke an old language of conspirators, and could not crack the whip or seize the day. Big-voiced scullions, herders, feelers round haycocks and hindquarters, talkers and buyers, slow arbitrators of the burial ground. Across that strand of yours the cattle graze up to their bellies in an early mist, and now they turn their unbewildered gaze to where we work our way through squeaking sedge, drowning in dew. Like a dull blade with its edge honed bright, Lybeck half shines under the haze. I turn because the sweeping of your feet has stopped behind me, to find you on your knees with blood and roadside muck in your hair and eyes. Then kneel in front of you in brimming grass and gather up cold handfuls of the dew to wash you, cousin. I dab you clean with moss, fine as the drizzle out of a low cloud. I lift you under the arms and lay you flat. With rushes that shoot green again, I plait green scapulars to wear over your shroud.
Hi, I'm Seán Hewitt. I was going to read a poem of Heaney's from The Human Chain. The poem is called The Riverbank Field, and it's after a section of the Aeneid. So it has some Latin in here, but Heaney translates it for us. The Riverbank Field. Ask me to translate what Lough gives as in a retired vale, a sequestered grove, and I'll confound the lethe in Moyler by coming through Beck Park down from Grove Hill across Long Riggs to the riverbank, which way by happy chance will take me past the Domus Placidas, those peaceful homes of Upper Braw. Moths then on evening water it would have to be, not bees in sunlight, midge veils instead of lily beds, but stepped to all the rest. The willow leaves Elysian silvered, the grass so fully fledged and unimprinted it can't not conjure thoughts of passing spirit troops, animae quibus altera fato corpora debentur, spirits, that is, to whom second bodies are owed by fate. And now to continue as enjoined to often in my own words. All these presences, once they have rolled time's wheel 1,000 years, are summoned here to drink the river water, so that memories of this underworld are shed, and soul is longing to dwell in flesh and blood under the dome of the sky. I really like that poem, and I chose it because I think it does something that Heaney does for me, which is to bring the mythic and the classical and the spiritual right down to earth and down to a particular locality. I love that line in the third line, I'll confound the lethe in Moyler. The word confound there I think is really special. We get a sense of surprising the lethe, ambushing it almost, and also mixing it together. The two of them become the same place, Moyler, the river Moyler and the river Lethe. And I love the way that through this poem you can hear Heaney thinking and talking to himself and speaking to us too. It's a very down to earth sort of poem. And now to continue as enjoined to often in my own words, and he has in my own words in quotation marks, and there's a kind of wryness in that. And there's a question that I had about the end of this poem about whether these presences that are felt in the, around the river, in the riverbank field, might also be words and thoughts longing to be clothed in language, to forget themselves and to become sort of transcendent at the end of the poem. And it's all done so understatedly. And I think that's the power, especially of late Heaney, to give us something that's at once so clever and intelligent and learned, but feels like he's just speaking to us as if he's quite casually translating something. So yeah, and then also we have the musicality, the sort of the syntactical power of this poem is just really great, and I think that's what I look to Heaney for, this musicality and the sense of the spiritual becoming localized and coming through the natural world in this poem.
Hello, my name's Tara Bergin. I'm a poet. I was born and grew up in Dublin, but I now live in the north of England, which is where I am now, reading to you about Seamus Heaney. My first encounter with Seamus Heaney was when I was sitting on the floor in my primary school looking at his shoes. He was giving a talk about being a poet. But it was about 25 years later, after I'd left Ireland and gone to England to study for a PhD, that I really started to read him closely. It was also at this time that I had the chance to meet him again. At a university event this time, and I was standing up, not sitting down, I uttered a few stumbling, embarrassed words to him and then hurriedly made to leave. And he said, "No, wait," and asked me a few more questions about my PhD. For me, that phrase, "no, wait," captured his ability to make someone feel completely at ease in his company. The Seamus Heaney poem that I want to read to you today is not a poem at all, but lines from an essay. I'm going to read from this tattered old copy of Preoccupations, which is a book that my dad gave to me many years ago and that I've read many times since and treasure it dearly. The extract comes from his well-known essay, Feelings into Words, that he wrote when he was 35, and that contains advice for the young poet. Many of you might recognize this paragraph. It made such a strong impression on me when I was starting out as a young poet that I've never forgotten it. And it goes like this. What I wish to suggest is that there is a connection between the core of a poet's speaking voice and the core of his poetic voice, between his original accent and his discovered style. I think that the discovery of a way of writing that is natural and adequate to your sensibility depends on the recovery of that essential quick. This is the absolute register to which your proper music has to be tuned. I remember when I first read that advice, I didn't know what to make of it. It took me a lot of arguing with this paragraph to understand what it might mean for me, a poet writing in a very different Ireland and a very different Irish accent to Heaney's. I didn't have his kind of language. I grew up in a capital city in the late 20th century, and there was a whole other side to my experience. Of course, finding the nerve to finally admit that to myself, that I was not the Seamus Heaney type of Irish poet, was exactly Heaney's point. It was only by realizing that there were elements of my voice I'd been keeping out of my poems for fear that they may not meet with expectation that I could start to experiment with letting them back in. I will never get tired of reading these essays in this book for their stylishness of articulation as well as their generous truths that can still speak directly to us no matter who we are. As Yeats says in the epigraph, if we understand our own minds, we move others, not because we have understood or thought about those others, but because all life has the same root.
The Otter. When you plunged, the light of Tuscany wavered and swung through the pool from top to bottom. I loved your wet head and smashing crawl, your fine swimmer's back and shoulders, surfacing and surfacing again this year and every year since. I sat dry-throated on the warm stones. You were beyond me. The mellowed clarities, the grape deep air, thinned and disappointed. Thank God for the slow loadening. When I hold you now, we are close and deep as the atmosphere on water. My two hands are plumbed water. You are my palpable, lithe otter of memory in the pool of the moment. Turning to swim on your back, each silent, thigh-shaking kick re-tilting the light, heaving the cool at your neck. And suddenly you're out, back again, intent as ever, heavy and frisky in your freshened pelt, printing the stones.
The backward look. A stagger in air, as if a language failed, a slate of wing. A snipe's bleat is fleeing its nesting ground into dialect, into variants. Transliterations were on the nature reserves. Little goat of the air of the evening, little goat of the frost. It is his tail feathers drumming elegies in the slipstream. of wild goose and yellow bittern as he corkscrews away into the vaults that we live off. His flight through the sniper's eyrie over twilight earthworks and wallsteads, disappearing among gleanings and leavings into the combs of a field worker's archive. This is a poem, as you know, from Wintering Out. And when I read it for the very first time, I think perhaps it was almost 20 years ago. And the very first thing that caught my attention was, and also as a Palestinian poet, as somebody who engages primarily with the Arabic language, how terms travel, but also terms travel within creatures, within beings, how we respond to borders, how, for instance, what we call habitats, what we call the origin, also travels with all these ideas and thoughts. And terms such as variants and dialects and transliterations are terms that belong, in fact, to the foreigner. They do not belong, they are not autochthonous to the English language. They belong to those who have contributed to the English language, who have entered the English language as strangers in particular, as people who have got their languages, and through these languages they can cross different linguistic spaces. As somebody from a refugee camp, to read such a thing and to feel that this poem concludes with the term archive, I felt that it, in fact, it's something that engages, but also, I would say, complements digging, because there is that promise which happens in the future. It's the field workers archive, but also digging concludes with, I'll dig, I'll write. And these acts of archiving, writing down, taking notes, that travel across different generations from the grandfather, for example, in digging, to the father, to Heaney as a child. I think that these are things that people live and people observe. But what Heaney was doing, and this is how I understood it, is to, in fact, to make remembering, to make thinking more accessible, that all of a sudden remembering is no longer hierarchical. It doesn't belong to you only. But in fact, the very focus is how remembering combined with rewriting and re-narrating would simply inject this text or this memory with a new life, with different afterlives, I would say. To see Seamus Heaney in Arabic, to see his name transliterated in Arabic was a very moving thing. I still remember frequenting this organization, which used to buy the local newspapers, and many teenagers, in fact, used to go there to scan through different types of news, sports, and other things. And that was, in fact, a rare occasion in a refugee camp, to see the newspaper, to hold it. We used to receive books as donations, mainly from the former Soviet Union. And of course, my father used to buy different books, and we would read them. And the vast majority of these books, in fact, were in translation. So translated from Russian, from English, from French into Arabic. And these are the things that we used to read, in addition, of course, to Arabic poetry, in particular, Palestinian, I would say, poetry. And I still remember, as I was scanning through the cultural supplement of one of the local newspapers, coming across, in fact, digging. And then, of course, I didn't know that that was digging or the translation of digging. And I, first of all, perhaps my main task was to decipher the first name, because I wasn't able to make sense of it. Sometimes you read a name and you realize that perhaps you must have seen it somewhere. And that name, like from the very beginning, Seamus looked very foreign to me in translation. And then, of course, I was fixated on the surname, and I still remember mentioning the surname to my older brother. And I think that he must have said that perhaps he's somewhere from Ireland or from Britain. And because in the translator's, in fact, introduction, the translator, I felt that he dwelt on the nationalist, in a sense, and he overlooked what, in fact, Seamus Heaney is and what his poetry is. But that was my very first encounter with something by Heaney translated into Arabic. And what's quite fascinating is to read the Arabic and then to read the English perhaps a year or a couple of years later. And I read it using this battered dictionary, also donated to us, in fact. And this second-hand battered dictionary helping me to decipher a very complex, in fact, poem. But what caught my attention was the translation of the verbal noun, digging, how it's translated in Arabic. And in the English language, as we know that it's very onomatopoeic, it's rather, in fact, it as a term, it does penetrate and it does go through things. But in Arabic, it conveys subtlety and it lacks long vowels. And that made me realize that a term such as digging can differ in its intensity in the English language, in the Arabic language. But also, in fact, I had to ask my father about this particular verbal noun in Arabic, and I was told that it lacks long vowels because as an act, it should be done discreetly. And this resonates, in fact, with writing as a non-vocal, in a sense, that the text itself can convey these sounds and the music and the rhymes. But in fact, the act itself is very subtle, and as though, of course, it's done at night, not during the day. So there is something that is happening. And of course, if we think about Macbeth as well, and of digging, and I think that there is something that, for instance, terms such as the gravedigger, and in Arabic, such terms are emphatic, so they are very vocal, and yet the act itself, digging, is very subtle, and it should be conducted discreetly. And that's why, if we just return to Heaney's poem, Digging, it concludes with the future tense. So it will happen. It will happen in the future. It will happen, but it will happen and it will endorse, absorb different shapes and forms. Not the physical, not the archaeological, perhaps something that would resonate with maybe a continuation of what the grandfather and the father did, but in Seamus Heaney's way. And that is writing and writing poetry. Go into education myself, and working as a teacher in the refugee camps in Lebanon, I felt, in fact, the need to teach poetry, but to teach poetry and to see how this would maybe contribute to the way we view things in writing. And Seamus Heaney, when I read his poetry now and reread, for example, specific poems, I realize how even rhymes such as these incomplete rhymes, for somebody who's a stranger, who's not a native speaker of the English language, I feel welcomed and hosted in this deficiency, in this incompleteness. I say that perhaps my errors in vowels can exist somewhere. And this is something that is so welcoming, Perhaps that wasn't Seamus Heaney's intention, but as someone who reads these words and realize that these are not direct rhymes, these are para-rhymes or incomplete rhymes, but they are quite prevalent. They are there, they are around. And for me, as a learner of the English language, as somebody who is dealing with the English language, I feel hosted. I feel that I can read with ease, but also it is sometimes when we look at a poem and we feel the need to return to this poem, I think that this shows that there is something that is inviting about it. And I think that, and that's why Seamus Heaney's poetry resonates with people. And I recall Seamus Heaney, in fact, differentiating between an audience and the readership. And I think that, in a sense, my listening to Heaney, my reading his work, and in particular, Death of a Naturalist, because that was the very first collection I held. First of all, I held some of these poems in translation, but also I held it, in fact, in the English language. And I used to work for this charity in Beirut. And they used to ask me to categorize books, for example, to say that these are for the secondary level, these are for, let's say, the university level, and to get paid. And I was asked to sift through mainly second-hand books. And then I came across Death of a Naturalist in English. I think that's signed by someone, perhaps donated to a particular bookshop within maybe Europe or the States, and reaching Lebanon, and then, of course, ending up in a refugee camp to be held by people, and then, of course, to see how such poems travel, because I think that when Heaney talks about his childhood, he talks about something that is going to travel, to move, that this childhood is not going to stay static. It's not going to stay the same. It's going to consume different observations and different experiences. That in that sense, in fact, I feel that Seamus Heaney's poetry, or maybe terms such as experience and innocence, collapse into one thing. They collapse into one thing. It's a third category in a sense, that they are inseparable. Nesting ground. The sand martin's nests were loopholes of darkness in the riverbank. He could imagine his arm going into the armpit, sleeved and straightened. But because he had once felt the cold prick of a dead robin's claw, and the surprising density of its tiny beak, he only gazed. He heard it cheeping far in, but because the men had once shown him a rat's nest in the butt of a stag, where its chaff and powdered corn stalks adhered to the moist pink necks and backs, he only listened. As he stood sentry, gazing, waiting, he thought of putting his ear to one of the abandoned holes and listening for the silence under the ground. It's it's very just to realize how all these creatures can coexist, and they can really share this very same place and very same perhaps setting, if were to involve time. I think that it is something that you can't but admire, you can't but return to, and this is really what Heaney is.
Here at the Institute of Irish Studies at the University of Liverpool, the work of Seamus Heaney is an important foundation stone, particularly when it comes to the teaching of literature. Early on, our students are initiated into the practice of literary criticism through his poetry, as Professor Frank Shovlin tunes their ears into the special frequency which carries Heaney's voice. Frank uses the poem Broke to show how a sense of place, a sense of home, of where one is from, of how one changes over time, and of how what one might become is channeled through language. Elsewhere in the literature curriculum, Heaney is central to our survey of 20th century and contemporary Irish writing and culture. We begin and end with lectures that connect Heaney to other major literary figures who, to some students, might seem over-intellectual, hyper-intellectual, remote, or even stuffy. But Heaney's responses to their work, without denying them any of their complexity, make them accessible. His criticism, along with the many, many interviews he gave on the subject of Irish literature, of literature more broadly, and on the art of writing, offer excellent lenses through which students might be introduced to less familiar Irish writers. In short, Heaney is our constant companion on this course. We encourage students to think about and read Heaney beyond the context of Irish literature, as a way of challenging them to think carefully and in a sophisticated way about how we organise national canons and create nations through cultures. Of all the writers they might encounter in their studies, Heaney is perhaps best suited to this essential task. The poems we have heard, and the poets we have heard from in these films, echo and amplify many of these reasons for starting students on Heaney early on. Bernard O'Donoghue, Heaney's close friend and editor, speaks of Heaney's extraordinary range, and his ability to produce the kind of poetry which shifts our understanding, he says, of what poetry can do. Bernard invites us to look and to see through Heaney's acute visual sense, directing our vision as readers through the scene of Heaney's poem, A Call. In Bernard's analysis, we see in various ways the social world of Heaney's poetry, a world in which grand preoccupations such as heritage, mortality, and spirituality are translated out of personal and into shared experience through language. Heaney comforts us. Heaney is for everyone, Bernard says. His gift is to express simply universal truths and sentiments. Gail McConnell identifies similar features in Heaney's poetry through her reading of Fodder. Indeed, what she identifies is the complex potential of identity itself. This potential is revealed and released to us as readers through a poetry that is written in the language of the ear as well as of the eye. Gail shows us how Heaney strikes a balance in his work. A poem which might force us to confront grave philosophical considerations, who polices how we speak, for example, might also convey to us a reassuring tenderness that gives us the confidence to name ourselves, as Gail puts it, using the language of home. Seán Hewitt draws our attention directly to the prominence of translation in Heaney's poetry and plays through his selection of the Riverbank field. Seán speaks of a striking characteristic. Heaney wore his learning and his intellect lightly. He brought the mythic and the classical and the spiritual quite literally down to earth in his manner of describing the natural world. Seán commented on the musicality of Heaney's poetic voice. There is a famous essay, The Makings of a Music, Reflections on Wordsworth and Yeats, in which Heaney explores his mixed poetic heritage. The essay appears in Preoccupations, and it's from that collection that Tara Bergin takes her chosen extract. She reads a piece of prose from the essay Feelings into Words, and reflects on what she takes as advice for young poets. Heaney makes us question what it means to be an Irish poet, and, but perhaps even more importantly, what it means to be a poet. Tara quotes from the epigraph to Preoccupations, which comes from W.B. Yeats. If we understand our own minds, writes Yeats, we move others, not because we have understood or thought about those others, but because all life has the same root. Heaney's work demonstrates that our capacity to understand and to feel and to respond to and in the world depends upon that recognition. That act of recognition defines Yousif Qasmiyeh's response to Heaney's poetry. Like Tara, Yousif touches upon Heaney's role as a teacher, but Yousif introduces us to Heaney in what will be for many of us an unfamiliar educational context, as he tells us of his first encounters with the poet's name and with his poetry in a refugee camp. There is for Yousif something comforting and connecting in the unfamiliarity of Heaney. As a learner of English, Yousif says, I feel welcomed in my deficiency, in my incompleteness. Yousif's moving anecdotes are proof of how Heaney's meaning travels across, if not transcends, time, place, and space, without ever losing a connection to its roots. We hope that you have enjoyed these recordings. Our profound thanks go to our 5 poets and to the Heaney estate for their generous support and contributions. And we hope very much to welcome you to another Institute of Irish Studies event in the future.